Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I see the clock, and it's extremely late, and I appreciate the fact that as I look around, I see many people here that have been here all day, in fact. And although we can't recognize them, they have been here in Ottawa, and I do want to welcome them to Ottawa. And I also want to thank them for everything that they've done as they sat through this debate and listened to what we've tried to put forward. And before I get into my speech, I do want to thank the member for Whitby for her comments, because she triggered me into thinking about something that I discussed today. Today, before I get into my speech, Mr. Speaker, I had an opportunity to meet with the Canadian Paralympic Association or Canadian Paralympic Committee, and I met with a gentleman by the name of Tom Walby, and he's on the board of directors for the CPC, and he's also the chair of Athletics Council. And we had a great discussion, and we talked about disabilities, and Mr. Walby was a judo athlete, and Mr. Walby unfortunately developed visual and hearing impairment and was no longer able to compete as an athlete in judo. And now he's got onto the CPC, onto the board of directors, and is working tremendously with this organization. And one of the conversations we had, Mr. Speaker, was the fact that we talked about disabilities. And when we talked about it, he said to me, and I agree 100% with it, is disabled people do not want to be called disabled. Disabled makes people believe that there's an impairment and there's a challenge. They aren't disabled. They are the same as everybody else in this world. They just happen to have a disability that impairs what they do. And that's an important thing that I think we need to extremely point out to all Canadians. So I want to start with that, and I appreciate the comments I had, and again, I appreciate the comments from the member from Whitby who spurred me to put that out there. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to be here and back today to discuss amendments that were put forward by the Senate of Canada with respect to Bill C-81, an act to ensure our barrier-free Canada. It's always a pleasure to be able to speak to important issues like this, and I appreciate the work that has been done on this bill, and I do think that it will go a long way towards making a difference for Canadians living with disabilities. With the support evident from all parties, it gives many of us an opportunity to talk about some of the issues that are important to each and every one of us, and important issues that deal with this legislation. So when I first spoke about this bill back in the fall, I had a few issues with it. Mainly, I felt that as though it did not contain enough real or tangible measures and results for those in Canada who live with disabilities. The intentions were good, however the legislation doesn't actually accomplish anything that will help people with disabilities and what they need. They wanted something that would have an impact on their lives. I feel like the amendments we're discussing today will help those going forward. One of the biggest issues I had with the initial version of C-81 was that I felt it was rushed. The Liberals took quite a long time in getting this matter to Parliament, yet when the bill was first introduced, it fell short of many expectations that Canadians with disabilities communities had. Although the Liberals had years to consult, there were gaps in the legislation they put forward that needed to be addressed. With the bill, while the bill is still not perfect, and many of my colleagues have pointed out many of its imperfections today, I do feel that the amendments put forward by the Upper House help to identify and rectify some of those gaps. Mr. Speaker, I'm glad that one of the amendments made to this bill is one that puts a specific timeline on the matter, by adding a specific year or period of time by which Canada without barriers will be achieved. There's a sense of urgency that is created. That urgency is necessary, as disabled people in Canada have been waiting for many years for this legislation to become law. In this case, the bill requires a Canada without barriers on or before January 1st, 2040. While this timeline might seem like a small part of this legislation, I actually feel that it is one of the most important aspects. Not only does it light a fire and force the federal government to get moving on the matter, it also gives those who have been waiting for a Canada without barriers some hope for things will truly get done in the future. I have always felt that the important part of what we do here in the House is to ensure that the outcomes that we do will be put forward and are measurable. We want to be sure that we get results. when we say we will get those results, and preferably before the deadline of January 1, 2040. The one issue that I do have with the timeline indicated in the amendments is that it is quite long. People in Canada who are living with disabilities want action, and they want it now. These are people who have lived their entire lives in this country, facing barriers each and every day, and they want to know that their government is committed to addressing issues of accessibility in a timely manner. Setting a goal that is over 20 years in the future may give the impression that this is not as much of a priority as it should be. We on this side of the House would have preferred a deadline of 10 years, as we believe that it is a reasonable timeline for Canada Without Barriers to be achieved. We know that many times action doesn't begin until a deadline looms over us. We do not want this to be the case for removing barriers for accessibility, and by setting the deadline for 20 years down the road, this becomes concerning. I am hopeful that organizations will do everything to have accessibility measures in place long before that timeline. Mr. Speaker, one thing that we all hold dear in this beautiful country of ours is the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It sets out what we as Canadians and people residing in Canada can come to expect in terms of how to participate in society and what rights we as individuals have. Now, Mr. Speaker, a number of the amendments in Bill C-81 seek to ensure the following. One point, and I quote, "Nothing in this Act, including its purpose of the realization of a Canada without barriers, should be construed as requiring or authorizing any delay in the removal of barriers or the implementation of measures to prevent new barriers as soon as it is reasonably possible," end quote. Simply speaking, this means that no agency in Canada would be able to create and set standards that were inconsistent with what is set out in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Furthermore, if barriers to accessibility can be removed before the legislative timeline of January 2004, they absolutely should be. There is no justification for delay. Another measure contained in the amendments to C-81 that I feel is essential to the success of the bill is as follows, and I'll quote again. "Persons with disabilities must be involved in the development and design of laws, policies, programs, services, and structures," end quote. This is key. As members of Parliament, it is our duty to consult with and work with those who are affected by the legislation that we put forward here in Ottawa. It is only logical that when it comes to creating a law that will lead to a Canada without barriers, we speak to those people who will actually face the barriers. It is one thing to consult with disabled Canadians, but it is another to have it enshrined in law, and they must be involved in the development of public policy that affects their everyday lives. The only people who truly know what challenges they are faced with and need to be overcome on a daily basis are those who live with disabilities or care for someone with a disability. I am pleased that it will now be a requirement that this community has a voice at the table going forward. Another amendment that has been made in Bill C-81 is respect to intersectionality. Intersectionality in the Act is defined as, quote, "the complex cumulative way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination combine, overlap, or intersect, especially in the experiences of marginalized individuals or groups. This may apply to many aspects of our identity, such as race, gender, and class, and it certainly applies to people in Canada who live with a disability." Initially, intersectionality was not a key part of C-81. Many disability advocacy groups across the country called for this to be strengthened, and I'm happy to see that it has been included in the proposed amendments. While it would be wonderful to say that we live in a country where discrimination doesn't exist, we all know that it is unfortunately not the case. Canada is a progressive country, yet unfortunately, there will always be some level of discrimination that is present in our society. I feel as though people living in Canada with disabilities would absolutely understand that as they face a level of discrimination, and most members in this House, including myself, will likely never experience. Any legislation that we put forward and that we expect to become law needs to address the fact that discrimination happens and that it is inappropriate and will not be tolerated. The amendment that addresses intersectionality is one that is necessary. By incorporating intersectionality into the measures outlined in C-81, Laws, policies, programs, services, and structures will be required to take into account the intersectional forms of discrimination faced by persons living with disabilities. Ultimately, organizations will have to recognize and account for intersectional discrimination when formulating their accessibility plans. This may not be easy, but it is what disabled people need and deserve. They have every right to participate in society just as anyone else does, and many are unfortunately all too familiar with the layers upon layers of discrimination that they might face, just to do things like go to work, run errands, or go to an appointment. As I previously stated, many advocacy groups called for the inclusion and strengthening of intersectionality in this bill, and I'm happy to see that the amendments have provided for that. Now, Mr. Speaker, one amendment to this bill that I personally have heard some feedback on is with respect to sign language. Some of you here may know my personal history. This already has been indicated to people, but I am hearing impaired as a result of a hit and run that I suffered and sustained when I was a teenager. I am fortunate that it is a partial hearing loss, and although I can still communicate with spoken language, over the years I've been slowly teaching myself sign language, although, as Mr. Speaker, you need to use it in order to keep using it. And unfortunately, I've not had that opportunity, and so I've failed in many of what I know, and I'm learning more, and I encourage everyone that is listening here today to continue to learn sign language as the important aspect that it does. Being hearing impaired, it is extremely challenging to communicate, not only in crowds, but also where there is background noise. It is frustrating when all you do or all you can do is smile and nod as if you heard the person speaking to you. There is a huge mental challenge in dealing with this issue. It is one that I go through at many meetings, and one that I know people with hearing disabilities are challenged day in and day out. Invisible disabilities are something that is not as widely talked about when it comes to Canadians living with a disability. I talk many times to students when I go around the riding, and when I ask them, when I talk to them and I say to them after I've talked about getting involved and talked about the great things that we do in this country, I do ask them, do you think I'm disabled? And they look at me, and every now and then there's one person puts their hand up because they probably think it's a trick question, but most of them say no. And then I tell them my story, and I try to point out to them the very fact that there are invisible disabilities that we do not know about and we do not talk about. Now, while all physical health is important, so is mental health. Every person from every walk of life deserves to feel valued, loved, and respected. We all have different challenges that we must face, but if we can accommodate for a group of people that typically feels marginalized and allow for them to feel included and appreciated, that is never a bad thing. By passing legislation that would create a Canada without barriers, it is my hope that those within the disabled community feel recognized and heard. We see you, we care about you, and we want to do what we can to make your daily lives easier. The amendment to Bill C-81 that concerns sign language is crucial. It includes and recognizes the use of American Sign Language. It includes the recognition of the Quebec Sign Language and Indigenous Sign Languages as the primary languages for communication used by deaf people in Canada. I am very glad that these languages have been included in this bill, as the deaf community is one that must be acknowledged when we discuss Canadians living with disabilities. Some people don't realize that there are more than one kind of sign language, but there are many that exist around the world. Similar to spoken language, there are between 138 and 300 different types of sign language that are used worldwide, and the UN recognizes only 45 of them. Each language has its own unique grammar, syntax, and vocabulary, and are legitimate languages in their own right. They deserve to be given the same status and recognition as any spoken language or other sign language. So I am pleased to see that both Quebec Sign Language and Indigenous Sign Languages have been given representation in this legislation. as it is necessary that we represent Canadians from coast to coast to coast, and not just those who might use the more common American Sign Language. For the deaf community, using sign language can become part of a cultural identity. It is important that as a government, that is acknowledged. We need to ensure that there are high levels of standards for those who use sign language, whether that is ASL, Quebec Sign Language, or an Indigenous Sign Language. Every Canadian should have the right to communicate in a way that works for them and to have their language recognized as legitimate and as having value. Now, Mr. Speaker, another component that was included in the amendments to this bill is one that would ensure that Canadian Transportation Agency, or the CTA, cannot respond to complaints about barriers to accessibility by reducing existing human rights protections for passengers with disabilities. Those with disabilities, especially of a physical nature, understand difficult travel can be. Air transportation in particular can be very cumbersome, and some cannot safely and confidently travel by plane at all due to limitations such as specialized wheelchairs and other necessary equipment. I personally have a constituent who faces limitations when it comes to travel. I would like to read an excerpt from a letter that she sent me, which outlines her struggles with travel. It reads, "My name is Keegan Dorgan, and I live in your constituency. I commute from Grenfell to Regina 3 days per week to attend a fabulous program at the University of Regina called Astonished. My dream is to fly to Alaska to visit my sister. I have a complex physical disability, and I use a wheelchair for mobility. I cannot sit independently from my wheelchair, and airplanes do not have designated wheelchair spots. Every summer, I spend at least 108 hours of challenging and exhausting driving time to visit with my sister in Alaska. A flight would take 15 to 20 hours." Her letter goes on to say, despite the oversight of both the CTA and Transport Canada, there are no provisions to improve accessibility to aircrafts for travelers who, because of their disabilities and for safety reasons, cannot sit in a standard airline passenger seat and must remain seated in their personal wheelchairs. These individuals are prevented from traveling any way except by land vehicles. Mr. Speaker, this young lady spends over 108 hours in Iran every year so that she can spend time with her family. In fact, she and her parents are currently preparing for a trip, their annual trip to Alaska, leaving within the next couple of weeks. While the amendments to C-81 may not specifically address her issue, I do feel it is important to present real-life situations that are being faced by real Canadians who live with a disability, yet want to take a family vacation just like everyone else. Now, Mr. Speaker, I also met a lady from Vancouver a few months back while I was traveling with my wife. This lady had her disabled adult son with her. She graciously shared her experiences of traveling with her son, and I can tell you it isn't an easy thing to do. He loved to travel, even with his severe disability, on ships, on planes. She had to have a team of family members with her to ensure that her son could be carried from point A to point B. Oftentimes, his wheelchair couldn't access certain areas of the ship, and the same for any portion that required travel by plane. She made it work, as many families do with those that care for someone who lives with a disability. But I could see that it was certainly a major struggle. While Bill C-81 may not address that issue outright, I do think it is important to bring attention to it, as the amendments do touch on the rights of the CTA. Over the years, I have heard from a number of Canadians who struggle with travel, and I do hope that this amendment can be a starting point to address that issue going forward. Mr. Speaker, we've heard from many Canadians about this legislation and many groups that are promoting this legislation. And I support that, and my colleagues, and I know around this House, support that movement. This is a first step. It is a first step to put forward legislation that, as we see with the amendments that have been made by the Senate, that we can improve and start with a base. But that base is, as I said, the base. It needs to be advanced, and it needs to be advanced as quickly as possible. Because the faster we do that, the faster we include people with disabilities as all Canadians. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.